So, like, imagine for a second that you break your arm. You go to the hospital, right? The doctor takes an x-ray, pulls it up on that little glowing screen, and just points to a jagged white line.
Right, it's obvious.
Exactly. It's binary, it's clean, it's either broken or it's not broken. And, we love that kind of precision. But when you look at modern marriage or family dynamics or just the legal frameworks governing how men and women interact today,
Yeah.
that x-ray machine is just completely shattered.
Oh, absolutely. It's the absolute definition of muddy waters.
Yeah. We are basically navigating this landscape where the rules seem to change entirely depending on, well, who is standing in front of the judge, and where biological reality is often just, entirely ignored by the very institutions that are supposed to protect us.
Yeah, it becomes even more disorienting when you start actually digging into the historical shifts because,
Yeah.
we're talking about deliberate structural changes over the last 60 years that have completely rewired those interactions.
Right. And if you are listening to this deep dive right now, you have probably felt that shift. You're likely someone who has noticed the mainstream narrative around masculinity, marriage, fatherhood, all of it turning increasingly hostile.
Which is a very common feeling right now.
Totally. So maybe you follow men's rights advocacy, or maybe you're interested in the red pill perspective, or honestly, maybe you're just insanely curious about the history of our modern institutions before they were, as some argue, captured by ideological movements like feminists and Marxists.
And that brings us to today's topic.
Yes, it does. Because today, we have a massive mission. We are doing a really extensive, completely impartial, deep exploration of this highly provocative new ebook. It's called Shackled, How the Marriage Revolution Betrayed Men. And it's written by Conrad Riker, published in 2025.
And this book is by design a very aggressive autopsy of the modern family unit. I mean, Riker's presenting a very specific, highly critical vantage point on how we got here.
He absolutely is. It is a heavy hitter. Now, really quick, before we get into the weeds here, I need to urgently remind you to like and subscribe to this show right now. If you find this breakdown fascinating, and trust me, the data and the legal horror stories we are about to cover are going to blow your mind.
Yeah.
You really need to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to buy Shackled for yourself.
It's definitely a deep rabbit hole.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
You should also follow the author on Substack at Conrad Riker, because the book just dives so deep into the legal, financial, and cultural mechanisms that Riker argues have, well, completely disenfranchised modern men.
Right, but before we go any further, I do actually need to pause here and just set some very clear ground rules for our discussion today.
Good call.
Because this book contains highly politically charged content. I mean, Riker heavily criticizes feminists, Marxists, and virtually all modern legal and social institutions. So I want to explicitly state to you, the listener, that we are not taking sides today.
Not at all.
We are not endorsing the author's viewpoints, nor are we here to validate the political stances taken in the book. Our job here is strictly analytical. We are impartially unpacking Riker's arguments, his data points, and his evolutionary theories just to understand the worldview presented in this original source material.
Okay, let's unpack this, because Riker's narrative arc is super fascinating. He doesn't just start with, modern dating apps or family courts. He starts right at the foundation.
Right, at the ideological roots.
Exactly. He traces this back to the roots of family destruction, and then he moves through the legal and financial crowbars used to pry the family apart, and finally lands on the modern marriage strike and the tangible red pill solutions that men are adopting right now.
It's a very systematic breakdown.
It really is.
Yeah.
So let's start at that foundation, because Riker makes it very clear. He does not believe the breakdown of the nuclear family was just some natural cultural evolution, does he?
No, not at all. And what's fascinating here is that Riker frames the entire shift as a deliberate, calculated blueprint. I mean, his fundamental premise is that the nuclear family was intentionally dismantled by a coalition of Marxist and early feminist thinkers.
Which sounds crazy until he explains why.
Right, because you have to ask, what is the utility of doing that? According to his analysis, the purpose was the transfer of loyalty. If you want to massively expand state power, a self-sufficient family unit with a strong patriarchal figure is basically a massive roadblock.
Because they don't need the government.
Exactly. That family relies on itself, it protects its own, it passes down its own values. Therefore, to make citizens entirely dependent on the state, that independent family structure had to be neutralized.
And he illustrates this with a truly chilling historical anecdote.
Yeah.
He takes us over to East Germany during the Cold War, dealing with the Stasi, the secret police.
And the Hans Müller story.
Yes. So there's this story he tells about a man named Hans Miller. Hans is just a normal guy raising his 6-year-old son. And one day, the kid is in art class and he draws a picture. Just a doodle of a pig wearing a top hat. Literally just a capitalist pig.
Right. Which, if you or I look at that today, it's just a kid drawing a cartoon he probably saw in a book or on TV. There's zero malicious intent there.
Zero. But in the absolute paranoia of East Germany, the teacher actually reports this child's doodle to the authorities as, quote, counter-revolutionary propaganda.
Unbelievable.
And the state uses this as justification to revoke Hans Miller's custody. He literally loses his son over a drawing. And Riker doesn't just throw the story in for shock value, right?
No, he uses it to highlight a really terrifying statistic. He notes that by 1989, right before the Berlin Wall fell, 94% of East German babies under 3 years old were warehoused in state-run Kinderkrippen centers.
94%.
Yeah. The state literally stepped in to become the parent.
And this is where Riker connects the historical blueprint to the modern day. Because he isn't just giving us a history lesson. He uses East Germany as a prologue.
Right, he looks at those Soviet-era nurseries, and then he compares them directly to modern Sweden's heavily subsidized, state-funded play collectives.
Where something like 90% of toddlers are in state care almost from birth.
Precisely. And he pairs that statistic with World Health Organization reports that paint a very grim picture. Because those reports show that Swedish teens currently have the highest depression rates in all of Europe.
Wow.
Yeah. Riker actually quotes a 14-year-old girl in Stockholm who told a researcher that she would rather FaceTime her state-appointed social worker than eat dinner with the strangers she calls mom and dad.
That is incredibly sad.
It is. But Riker is arguing that when you replace the biological evolutionary family structure with the bureaucratic state apparatus, the psychological fallout for the children is catastrophic. They just lose their grounding.
And if you're listening and thinking, well, that's Europe, that's over there, Riker brings it right to our doorstep. He analyzes California's recent Senate Bill 321.
Oh, the community parenting pods.
Yes. He describes this as a $200 million taxpayer-funded plan for what they literally call community parenting pods. Riker argues this is just the Kinderkrippen reborn for the 21st century. Except, instead of saluting Karl Marx, the kids in these pods are being taught gender-fluid concepts and quoting Robin DiAngelo.
And this ties directly into the feminist ideological roots that Riker identifies. He spends a lot of time in the book on Shulamith Firestone.
Right, the radical feminist from the 70s.
Yeah, a highly influential thinker. And Firestone didn't mince words. I mean, she explicitly demanded the abolition of the biological family. She argued that children actually belong to the collective.
She hated the whole concept of pregnancy, didn't she?
She went so far as to call the biological process of pregnancy barbaric. And she advocated for the invention of artificial wombs so that they could completely sever women from the biological realities of motherhood.
Which brings us to one of the most surreal parts of the book, honestly. Because Firestone's 1970s sci-fi feminist theory is actually happening right now.
It really is.
Riker points out that there is currently an artificial womb lab in New York City working on synthetic amniotic fluid. And he juxtaposes Firestone's lofty ideological goals with a real-world 2023 lawsuit involving Elon Musk.
Yes, this case perfectly encapsulates Riker's view on the absurdity of modern gender dynamics.
It's wild.
Yeah.
So an ex-partner of Musk sued him over the use of prototype artificial womb technology. And you would think the legal complaint would be about, the complex bioethics of gestating a human in a machine.
Right, the deep moral questions.
But no. Her complaint was that using the artificial womb robbed her of her tiger stripes, her stretch marks, which she felt deprived her of the authentic maternal aesthetic.
It's a really striking anecdote because it highlights what Riker views as the inherent, often narcissistic contradictions in these ideological movements. He actually points to a 2026 Gallup poll cited in the book.
Oh, this poll was fascinating.
The poll claimed that 68% of self-identified feminists initially supported artificial womb technology, viewing it as the ultimate liberation. But, and this is key, their support plummeted when pollsters pointed out that if gestation happens outside the female body, men might have equal claim to the child from day one.
Meaning they wouldn't be on the hook for traditional child support.
Exactly. Suddenly the enthusiasm vanished.
So they want the biological liberation, but they definitely don't want to give up the legal and financial leverage that biological motherhood currently provides.
That's his argument. And this leads directly into Riker's evolutionary argument. Because he believes that ignoring biological realities in favor of ideological social engineering is basically a recipe for societal collapse. He says it always has been.
I want to dig into this because he brings in some really heavy anthropological data to back this up. He cites this massive 2019 Harvard study that looked at the historical survival rates of matrilineal societies versus patrilineal societies.
This is really a foundational pillar of his worldview. So, the Harvard anthropologists examined historical data and found that 78% of matrilineal societies, meaning cultures where lineage, property, and authority are traced through the mother, crumbled or were entirely conquered after the year 1800.
78%. That's huge. And the patrilineal ones?
Contrast that with patrilineal societies, which had only a 12% extinction rate during the same exact period. So Riker uses this data to argue that cultures prioritizing maternal collective models simply lack the aggressive, defensive, and organizational capabilities required to survive the brutal realities of human history.
Okay, but explain the why behind that, though, because he compares the Muso tribe in China to the Han Chinese. Like, how does he explain the mechanics of why one survives and the other just becomes a tourist attraction?
It comes down to biological incentives. So the Muso practice what anthropologists call walking marriages.
Which means what, exactly?
It means men sneak into women's bedrooms at night, but they have absolutely no formal claim to the children they produce. Uncles raise the kids instead of fathers. Wow, okay.
Because the biological fathers have no guaranteed paternity, no authority in the household, and no legacy to pass down, their evolutionary drive to build, to conquer, and to invent is completely stifled. Riker points out that the Mozuo produced no standing armies, no grand architecture, and no written languages.
They just kind of existed.
Yeah, they eventually just became a novelty tourist attraction managed by the Chinese government.
Whereas the Han Chinese, on the other hand.
Right, the Han Chinese utilized strict patrilineal dynasties. By guaranteeing men paternity and a legacy, meaning a man knows for sure his sons are his, and his wealth will pass down to them, you unleash male competitive drive.
And that drive is what built the Great Wall.
Exactly. It's what maintained vast, sprawling empires for thousands of years. Riker actually makes a similar comparison in Indonesia with the Minangkabau. They are the world's largest matrilineal society.
What did they build? Well, their cultural achievements consist mostly of elaborate wood carvings and traditional dances, but functionally they lived with open sewers. He contrasts this with the Dutch colonizers who eventually arrived there.
And the Dutch were patriarchal.
Strictly patriarchal. They arrived and immediately started building universities, complex shipping routes, and massive global trade empires.
He even takes a swing at the Disney version of Mulan to make this point, which I thought was hilarious.
Yeah, as he does.
He points out that modern feminists love the myth of Mulan dismantling the patriarchy, but the actual historical records show the real Mulan returned home immediately after her military service, specifically to submit to male authority. First her father, and eventually a husband.
And why is that?
Because ancient China fundamentally relied on that rigid patriarchal structure for national defense. If the men didn't have families to protect and rule, they wouldn't fight the invading hordes.
Right. Riker's ultimate thesis here is that matrilineal systems might produce beautiful pottery and egalitarian folk songs, but patrilineal systems build the physical and defensive infrastructure of civilizations that actually endure.
He has a great line where he describes this modern shift away from patriarchy as replacing the alpha wolf with a village that raises arsonists.
That is a very Riker quote.
But I do have to push back a little here, because there's a famous historical event that gets brought up constantly by feminists to prove the exact opposite of what he's saying.
You're talking about Iceland.
Yes. What about Iceland's 1975 Women's Day Off? In 1975, 90% of women in Iceland stopped working, refused to cook, refused to clean, and the whole country basically ground to a halt. Doesn't that prove society relies entirely on women?
That is a very common counter-argument, and Riker actually addresses that exact event in the book. He acknowledges the data. The strike did tank Iceland's GDP by 9% overnight.
Right.
It caused massive disruption. However, he emphasizes a detail that often gets left out of the celebratory narratives. The strike only lasted exactly 24 hours.
Oh, really? Just one day?
Just one day. And why is that? Because, according to Riker, while women's labor is economically important, society fundamentally requires male physical labor to literally keep the lights on.
Because men do the dirty jobs.
Exactly. During that strike, the men kept the geothermal power plants online. Men kept the water treatment facilities pumping. Men kept the emergency infrastructure functioning. Riker argues that equality activists ignore this brutal reality. Society needs male labor, male risk tolerance, and male biological drive to survive, even as that same society increasingly rejects male authority.
Okay, so that sets the ideological and evolutionary stage. But Riker argues that an ideology can't just wish a new society into existence. If the state wanted to replace fathers and break the patrilineal model, it needed actual tangible tools to do so.
They needed a mechanism.
Right. They needed a financial crowbar.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the next massive shift, the implementation of the welfare state and no-fault divorce.
This is a crucial pivot in Riker's book. He transitions from sociological theory to real, legal, and economic execution. His argument here is that government welfare programs were never actually designed to erase poverty.
Which goes against everything we're taught.
Right. Instead, he says their functional purpose was to subsidize single motherhood, effectively allowing the state to step in as the primary provider. And simultaneously, the introduction of no-fault divorce converted husbands from undisputed heads of households into what he calls indentured servants.
Let's look at the numbers he provides, because they are just staggering. He traces the explosion of the welfare state back to Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society programs in 1965. Riker notes that since 1965, welfare spending in the U.S. has tripled.
Tripled, yes.
But the poverty rate barely budged.
Yep.
Instead, what exploded was single motherhood, up by 400%.
Yeah, he cites data from the Brookings Institute showing a direct mathematical correlation. Every additional dollar injected into welfare actually slashes marriage rates by 2% in those communities.
And he points to Baltimore, right?
He points to Baltimore as the prime tragic example of this policy. According to Riker, 70% of children in Baltimore now grow up without fathers in the home, resulting in crime rates that are triple the national average. Riker argues this isn't an accidental side effect, it is the predictable, mathematical result of incentivizing fatherlessness.
And he claims that early feminist leaders knew exactly what they were doing with this. He quotes a 1972 manifesto from the National Organization for Women.
NOW.
Yeah. They didn't talk about welfare as a temporary safety net. They explicitly declared welfare as, quote, liberation from patriarchal breadwinners. Think about that. The state literally stepping in to replace the husband.
Riker makes a point here that I found really challenging. He argues that women making these choices to go on welfare instead of marrying the father of their children aren't acting irrationally at all.
No, not at all. If you look at it purely through the lens of resource acquisition, it is a completely rational choice.
If a woman in a low-income bracket can get guaranteed housing, food stamps, and medical care from the state, basically a reliable, faceless beta provider that never argues back, why would she tie herself to a man working 60 hours a week for minimum wage?
Especially when the state's rules dictate that if he moves into the house, she loses her benefits.
Exactly. The system actively financially penalizes her for forming a nuclear family.
So that handles the lower economic brackets. The state becomes the husband. But Riker argues the state needed a totally different tool to dismantle the middle and upper class family. Because, you can't tempt a doctor's wife with food stamps.
Right, she already has resources.
So what's the tool? No-fault divorce. And the irony here is just unbelievable because he points out this was spearheaded by a massive conservative icon. Ronald Reagan signed America's first no-fault divorce law in California in 1969.
It is a profound historical irony. Riker claims Reagan pushed this legislation not out of some grand sociological vision, but for highly personal reasons.
To save his own skin, basically.
Yeah, to save his own marriage and keep Nancy from finding out about his past secrets in Vegas during a messy, public, fault-based divorce. But the societal fallout of making marriage a contract that can be broken by one party for any reason was cataclysmic. California's divorce rate tripled within 2 years of Reagan signing that bill.
I mean, think about it like a business contract. If you and I sign a contract to build a business, and I decide I'm bored and want to leave, I don't get to take half the business and force you to pay me a salary for the next 10 years.
No court would uphold that.
But Riker argues that's exactly what no-fault divorce did to marriage. It's a complete breach of contract that exclusively punishes the higher earner, which is historically the man. He argues that the state swapped the vow till death do us part for till the state takes your part.
And this required a massive shift in how courts handled alimony. To justify these massive wealth transfers from men to women, Riker points to the Lenore Weitzman scandal.
Oh, this was wild to read about. Who is Lenore Weitzman and what did she do?
So Lenore Weitzman was a sociologist who published a highly influential study in 1985. Her study claimed that after a divorce, a woman's standard of living plummeted by 73%, while a man's standard of living actually rose by 42%.
And everyone just believed it.
This data was treated as absolute gospel. It was cited by judges, lawmakers, and feminists across the country to justify completely rewriting alimony and child support guidelines nationwide, making them far more punitive toward men.
But Riker highlights the subsequent revelation that her data was completely fabricated, right?
Well, fabricated or deeply flawed, depending on who you ask in the sociological community, but Riker leans heavily into the idea that it was academic fraud. Later audits of her work found massive mathematical errors. Her own data didn't support her conclusions.
Unbelievable.
But Riker claims the damage was permanently done. The laws were changed based on a lie to balance the scales of justice and redistribute men's paychecks. The result today, according to Riker's data, is a system where 45% of divorces are initiated by women, yet men pay 97% of all alimony.
He uses some truly tragic, high-profile examples to make this visceral. He talks about Patrick Wayne, the son of the legendary actor John Wayne. Here's a guy with a Hollywood legacy, born into wealth. But after two brutal, financially devastating divorces, Patrick Wayne ended up working as a greeter at Walmart.
It's a stark image.
Riker says you start out as the star of your own Western, and thanks to family courts, you end up as an extra in your ex-wife's rom-com.
He also introduces a more relatable everyday anecdote. He calls him Chad from Bakersfield.
Oh yeah, Chad.
Chad is the quintessential hardworking guy. He marries his high school sweetheart, works decades in the oil fields or construction to buy a house and a Corvette. Then, out of nowhere, she files for no-fault divorce. Chad suddenly finds himself sharing his Corvette's title not with his wife, but with her ruthless divorce lawyer.
And what happens to his money?
Riker claims Chad's ex is now road tripping across the country with her 25-year-old yoga instructor named Sunbeam, funded entirely by Chad's backbreaking labor via mandatory alimony.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Riker uses a really striking analogy to summarize this. He compares modern marriage to a timeshare in North Korea.
That's a vivid picture.
Right. You are pressured into signing the contract, you are completely locked in, the rules change constantly based on the whims of a dictator, in this case the family court judge, and you have zero actual equity. Which leads to a terrifying question. If the state is acting as the new husband through welfare for the poor and acting as the enforcer of wealth transfer for the middle class, what happens to actual biological fatherhood?
According to Riker, biological fatherhood in America is effectively criminalized or discarded. Fathers are treated as entirely disposable, useful only for their financial output.
But it doesn't have to be that way.
And to prove that this isn't the only way a modern society has to function, he contrasts the American fatherhood desert with modern-day Hungary.
Right, Hungary took a totally different approach.
Exactly. Hungary realized their demographic collapse was a severe crisis, so they implemented aggressive pro-family tax policies. For example, if a Hungarian woman marries and has 3 children, she pays 0 income tax for the rest of her life.
Oh, zero.
0. They offer subsidized loans for families to buy large cars and homes, but the loans are forgiven based on the number of children you stay married and raise.
And what was the result? Did it work?
The result was a 27% boost in marriages and births. Riker uses this to prove a fundamental point. Men do not fear responsibility. Men want families. They simply reject the American system that replaces their natural authority with bureaucratic paperwork and treats them like nothing more than walking ATMs.
When you align the financial incentives with biological family formation, men enthusiastically step up. Okay, so if a man realizes that welfare and alimony are stacked against him financially, his next logical step would be to look at the legal system for protection. Like, surely the courts will be fair. But this is where Riker takes us into the absolute darkest part of the book. Because the legal system itself, specifically family courts, is what he calls a feminist kangaroo tribunal.
That is incredibly strong language. But it reflects his premise that family courts operate on what he dubs the Three Stooges theory of justice.
Which means?
He argues that in family court, actual evidence and constitutional rights are routinely ignored in favor of bureaucratic extortion. He claims judges rubber stamp false allegations, block men from discovering the truth about their own families, and actively reward female infidelity.
Let's talk about paternity fraud, because this section was agonizing to read. He tells the story of a guy named Walter. Walter is dragged into court by his ex-girlfriend. The judge orders Walter to pay $1,200 a month in child support. But Walter gets a DNA test, and the test definitively proves 100% scientific fact that Walter is not the biological father of this child.
And any rational person listening to this would assume the case just gets thrown out.
Right. But Riker points out that the judge ordered Walter to pay anyway. Why? because the judge ruled that Walter had briefly, quote, acted like a father figure while baiting the mother.
Which sets an incredibly dangerous precedent.
Riker notes that currently, 45 states block paternity fraud lawsuits, or make it incredibly difficult for men to disestablish paternity once a certain amount of time has passed. And they do it all under the guise of the best interest of the child. Riker argues this essentially indentures men to a lie. It turns them into financial slaves based entirely on a woman's deception.
And Riker links this deception directly to biological imperatives. He spends a lot of time analyzing hypergamy.
Let's pause and define that, because he uses that term a lot. What exactly is hypergamy in this context?
Hypergamy is the evolutionary psychology concept that women are biologically wired to constantly seek a mate of higher status, wealth, or physical dominance than their current partner.
Always trading up.
Right. While a man might be content to marry across or down the socioeconomic ladder, hypergamy suggests women inherently look up the ladder. Riker cites a 2010 Match.com survey where 33% of women anonymously admitted to cheating, specifically to upgrade their partners.
He also references a 2013 study in the Journal of Sexual Medicine that looked at ovulating women. The study showed that when women are at peak fertility, they are 24% more likely to cheat. And they typically cheat with highly masculine and dominant men, rather than the safe, reliable beta provider they might be married to.
Riker uses this data to argue a profound point. The legal system has removed all penalties for this destructive biological behavior. Historically, society enforced strict penalties against adultery to protect the nuclear family and guarantee paternity for men.
But the asymmetry in the law today that he points out is staggering. He notes that before 1970, 44 states actively jailed people for adultery. It was a serious crime.
Yes, it was.
Today, he notes, only 16 states even have it on the books, and they rarely, if ever, enforce it. So a woman can cheat, break the marriage, and face zero legal consequences. But what happens if a man falls behind on child support for a kid that, like Walter, might not even be his?
That's where the state bears its teeth. Riker points out that the government utilizes the 1950 Uniform Support Act. He describes this as a massive, nationwide snitch network.
Yeah.
If a man misses payments, the state will hunt him down across state lines, suspend his driver's license, freeze his bank accounts, and physically throw him in a cage. What's fascinating here is how Riker views this evolution of the law. He doesn't just see the legalization of adultery as a moral decay, he views it as the state officially outsourcing the execution of marriage to divorce courts.
So the state is the hitman.
Essentially, no-fault divorce means a cheater can walk away with half a man's assets, while the man is forced to fund his ex-wife's new lifestyle with her new partner through alimony under threat of imprisonment.
And if a man actually tries to fight back in court, say he wants custody of his kids and refuses to just roll over, Riker claims women are encouraged by their lawyers to use the nuclear option. False allegations of abuse.
Yes, the silver bullet of family court. Riker cites FBI data stating that 8% of rape allegations are provably false, and he claims 90% of those false claims originate from women. But in family court, the standard of proof is much lower than in criminal court.
He uses the 2006 Duke lacrosse team case as the ultimate mainstream example of this dynamic. 3 innocent college athletes had their lives, their reputations, and their futures completely torched by a false accusation of assault.
A terrible situation.
And Riker points out that this lie was eagerly amplified by an ambitious prosecutor, Mike Nifong, who actively hid exonerating DNA evidence just to secure a politically popular conviction. Riker argues that the exact same dynamic happens daily in closed-door family courts during custody battles.
Where evidence doesn't always matter.
Right. An unverified accusation of domestic abuse or child abuse is often all it takes for a judge to issue a restraining order, strip a man of his children, force him out of his own home, and ruin his life.
It's an incredibly bleak picture.
Wait, I'm struggling with this.
It's
Because if the system is as rigged as he says, and the financial ruin is practically guaranteed, why wouldn't a rational guy just sign a bulletproof prenuptial agreement before getting married? Surely contract law still applies in America, right? If you sign a legal document protecting your premarital assets, you're safe.
Riker actually anticipates that exact argument, and he is deeply, profoundly cynical about prenups.
What?
To illustrate why, he shares the story of a man named Jake. Jake is a successful tech executive earning $220,000 a year. Before getting married, Jake does everything right. He hires lawyers, his fiancée hires lawyers, and they sign a comprehensive prenup protecting his tech stock and his income. But 3 years later, his wife, who had voluntarily quit her job as a teacher to stay home, files for divorce.
Okay, but the judge upholds the prenup, right? That's what it's for.
No. Riker says the judge shredded the prenup like confetti at a gender reveal party.
You have got to be kidding me. On what grounds?
The judge's rationale was that because Jake had such a high salary and his wife had sacrificed her earning potential during those 3 years, Jake was deemed the real beneficiary of the marriage, and enforcing the prenup would leave the wife in an unconscionable financial state.
So the contract meant nothing.
Riker's brutal lesson here is that in what he calls feminist jurisprudence, a prenuptial agreement is about as enforceable as a pinky swear. The judge has absolute discretion to throw it out if they feel it disadvantages the woman.
Wow. So according to Riker, the financial architecture and the legal systems are a complete inescapable trap. But you can't just spring a trap like that on half the population without them rebelling. How do you get millions of men to just walk into the wood chipper?
And this is where Riker argues the culture at large, schools, universities, media comes into play.
They have to condition the boys.
Yes. He argues that for this system to function seamlessly, male resistance has to be broken early. He sees a coordinated psychological operation across the education system and corporate media. The goal is to chemically and ideologically castrate boys, framing traditional masculinity, aggression, competition, stoicism as inherently toxic or diseased.
He calls it the war on boys. And the medicalization of boyhood is terrifying. He gives the example of a Texas father in 2019 who is facing literal handcuffs for medical neglect.
Because of ADHD medication.
Exactly. Because the father refused to give his son Ritalin.
There.
Riker views the massive overprescription of ADHD medication to young boys as state-sanctioned chemical castration. Instead of letting boys run, wrestle, and burn off energy, the feminized school environment forces them to sit perfectly still for 8 hours a day. And if they can't, they are drugged into compliance.
And once those artificially sedated boys reach university, Riker argues the ideological indoctrination goes into overdrive. He analyzes a specific feminist theory syllabus from UC Berkeley.
Oh, this is crazy.
It had 27 required texts for the semester, 0 were authored by men, and every single text framed male behavior, history, and psychology as fundamentally oppressive and destructive.
Just a one-sided echo chamber.
Completely. He points out there wasn't a single reading on the syllabus addressing why men die younger, why men work 90% of the deadliest jobs, or the systemic bias men face in criminal and family courts.
He even points to corporate America getting in on the grift, which breaks it out of the ivory tower and into everyday life. He mentions Starbucks forcing their baristas to take unlearning masculinity workshops.
Which is just bizarre.
It is. And the media hypocrisy he highlights to maintain this narrative is just absurd. Think about the articles you see shared on social media. He brings up a real 2022 Washington Post piece that literally claimed male anger is climate change's hidden cause.
Oh, I remember that headline.
The premise was that toxic men drive gas-guzzling trucks because they are angry at women.
But Riker actually did the legwork on that one. He checked the underlying academic study the Washington Post cited for that claim, and the study didn't even mention men once.
Unbelievable.
It was a completely fabricated narrative layered over unrelated data to generate anti-male clickbait.
Contrast that with how the media treats male journalists who try to present balanced data.
Right. Riker mentions a journalist named Mike who was fired in 2022. Mike wrote a balanced, statistically accurate piece on domestic violence that simply cited court data showing that roughly 11% of domestic abuse claims during divorces are fabricated for legal leverage.
Just stating the data.
Yes. Mike was fired for platforming misogyny and creating an unsafe work environment. Yet, Riker points out the staggering double standard. Rolling Stone magazine faced virtually no individual consequences for publishing their infamous 2014 A Rape on Campus story.
It was the UVA hoax, right?
Yes. That story was proven to be a massive, fabricated hoax that ruined the lives of innocent men at the University of Virginia. The reporter kept her career, the editors moved on, and the destruction of male lives was treated as a minor oopsie.
And we can't forget the corporate backlash, because men eventually started speaking with their wallets. Think about the last time you watched a commercial that actively insulted you. Riker loves talking about the famous 2019 Gillette ad.
Ah, yes, the Best Men Can Be campaign. Gillette decided to lecture their own male customer base about toxic masculinity, depicting men in the commercial as either aggressive sexual predators or whimpering soy boys needing female correction.
And the backlash was biblical. Riker notes that Gillette's core demographic absolutely revolted. Their market share nosedived from 70% to 54%, and the parent company Procter & Gamble had to take an $8 billion write-down.
$8 billion.
$8 billion lost because they insulted their buyers.
Meanwhile, competitors seized the opportunity. Dollar Shave Club dropped an ad that just celebrated normal guys fixing cars, being dads, and grilling steaks, and their sales rocketed 130%.
Supply and demand.
Harley-Davidson leaned into the rebellion too with a Snowflakes Don't Ride campaign celebrating raw, unfiltered masculinity and boosted their male buyers by 14%. Men showed that they will financially destroy companies that hate them.
So wait, this raises a huge question. If the media and the public narrative hate traditional masculinity so much, and pushing that narrative literally loses companies billions of dollars in market share, why do female journalists and corporate boards continue to push it so aggressively? What is the incentive?
Riker explains this using a fascinating evolutionary status games theory. He calls it the tribal shaman theory.
Oh, this is good. How does that work?
He argues that in modern progressive circles, female journalists, HR directors, and academics gain massive social capital by acting as modern tribal shamans. A shaman's power comes from convincing the tribe that an invisible evil spirit is cursing them, and only the shaman knows the magic ritual to banish it.
Ah, I see where this is going.
In the modern context, these academics and journalists manufacture a fake, omnipresent threat, toxic masculinity, or the patriarchy. They convince society this invisible force is the root of all misery. Then they position themselves as the sole cure, the ones who can smash the patriarchy through their books, their diversity seminars, and their HR policies.
So they create the problem to sell the solution.
By doing this, they collect accolades, corporate grants, and immense cultural power. The fact that this cure actively damages actual men and boys is irrelevant to them. It's about securing their own high-status position in the tribe.
The shaman, manufacturing the curse to sell the cure. That is a brilliant way to frame it. Okay, so if the ideology is set, the legal traps are laid in family court, and the cultural shamans are actively hostile, what are men actually doing about it? Because, you don't see men marching in the streets with picket signs.
No, you don't. And according to Riker's documentation, that's the genius of the male response. They aren't organizing protests because protests require asking the system for permission or validation. Instead, men are executing what he calls a marriage strike.
A quiet rebellion.
They are collectively fighting back by simply walking away. They are opting out of a rigged game and, increasingly, moving their assets and their energy to parallel economies where the state cannot reach them.
The stats on this marriage strike are eye-opening. Think about your own friend group. Riker cites Pew Research showing that a staggering 63% of men under 30 currently refuse to wed.
63% is a massive demographic shift.
It is. He notes that overall marriage rates have plummeted 60% since 1972. He tells the story of a 28-year-old Texas electrician. This guy makes good money, but he told his girlfriend he would rather weld his own eyelids shut than drop $15,000 on a diamond ring to enter a state-sanctioned contract where he loses half his assets, his house, and his future income just because she might get bored or want to find herself 5 years down the line.
And Riker attributes a lot of this strike to what he calls the sex recession, which is heavily driven by the brutal, mathematically unforgiving realities of modern dating apps.
Oh man, dating apps.
If you've ever swiped on a dating app, you've experienced this. He points to Tinder's own internal data showing the 80-20 rule in absolute action.
Explain the math on that because it's brutal.
The algorithm data shows that women on Tinder swipe right, meaning they express interest on only 4.5 to 14% of male profiles.
So
They are ruthlessly filtering for the absolute top tier of men based on height, jawline, and perceived wealth.
So the top 10 to 20% of men are hoarding all the dating attention, and the bottom 80% of average, normal working guys are fighting for scraps, or getting zero matches at all.
Exactly. And Riker argues this is hypergamy scaling infinitely. Historically, hypergamy was constrained by geography. A woman had to choose the best man in her village. But dating apps give her access to the top 1% of men in a 50-mile radius.
Wow, yeah, that changes everything.
Furthermore, the welfare state we discussed earlier removed a woman's financial need to settle for an average working man. So the average man realizes he is playing a rigged game where he is viewed as entirely inadequate. And what does a rational person do when a game is rigged? He stops playing.
But they aren't just sitting in their basements playing video games, which is the stereotype. Riker details a massive, sophisticated financial rebellion tied to the crypto renaissance. He talks about the Bitcoin samurai movement.
A very modern solution to a legal problem.
Right. Men are realizing that if they build wealth in a traditional Bank of America account or a 401k, the family courts can and will seize it with a stroke of a pen.
So they turn to decentralized networks to build untraceable, unseizable wealth. Riker shares an incredible story from a wealth management firm called Ronin Consulting. They had a client who saw a divorce coming. So he legally parked a massive amount of Tesla stock in a complex Puerto Rican LLC, and then gifted the controlling interest to a blind trust managed in the Cayman Islands by a friend.
Oh, this is like a movie.
When the man's wife eventually filed for divorce, and her lawyer aggressively demanded complete financial discovery to take half his net worth, the husband's lawyer effectively slid a piece of paper across the table and said, quote, "Sorry, counselor, the servers holding the private keys are in Antarctica. Good luck subpoenaing a penguin."
That is wild. The state, with all its police power, literally cannot touch the blockchain. You can't put a cryptographic key in handcuffs. Riker even cites something called the Coinbase Marriage Report.
Yes, the Coinbase Marriage Report.
It claims that crypto investors report triple the marital satisfaction of traditional fiat investors.
And why is that? Because the blockchain is unforgiving code. It's high-stakes, testosterone-driven risk that rewards mathematical competence. There are no HR departments to complain to, no diversity quotas to fulfill, no family court judges who can alter the contract based on their feelings, just cryptographic truth. It is a purely meritocratic masculine domain.
He contrasts two archetypes to hammer home how men are reallocating their resources in this strike. First, we have Ken from Nebraska. Ken is the guy trying to play by the new progressive rules. He donated $5,000 to the UN's Heforshi feminist campaign.
He is trying his absolute hardest to be the good, modern, sensitive male ally.
Right. He thinks that's what women want because that's what the media says.
Yeah.
And how did his wife respond? She divorced him, explicitly citing his performative wokeness and lack of traditional masculine spine as sexually repulsive.
Ouch. And the contrast to Ken is Brad from Grand Rapids.
Brad took a totally different path. Brad had saved up a $120,000 wedding fund. But instead of buying an engagement ring and putting a down payment on a house to start a family, Brad walked into a dealership and bought a Lamborghini Huracan.
And Riker notes that the moment Brad posted a picture with that car, his Tinder matches exploded by 300% overnight.
It's just the reality of the game.
Brad's cold, calculated logic. At least the Lamborghini won't hire a lawyer and take half his assets in a divorce.
Okay, so Riker talks about guys turning to offshore wallets, joining the Bitcoin samurai, listening to podcasts like Escape Simphood, and buying supercars. I have to ask, is this just men taking their ball and going home? Mainstream articles would look at Brad and say, this is just a retreat into monastic solitude and materialism because these men are terrified of strong women.
That is exactly how the mainstream media portrays it, but Riker vehemently reframes the entire phenomenon. He uses a labor union analogy, which is brilliant.
How does that apply?
He says this isn't a retreat of cowards, it is a calculated market correction. Think about a labor union going on strike against a factory with exploitative, dangerous working conditions. The workers don't leave because they hate working. They leave to force the factory owners to the negotiating table.
Wow, okay.
Riker argues men are doing the same thing. They are collectively withdrawing their emotional commitment, their physical labor, their protection, and their financial resources until the fundamental marriage contract is renegotiated to offer them fair terms and guaranteed paternity. It is a strategic boycott of a system that monetizes their disposability.
Which sets up the climax of the book.
Yeah.
If men are striking against the old system, they can't just sit in the void forever. They must be building something new. Riker outlines what he calls actionable red pill strategies for reclaiming the fortress.
Yes. Riker's concluding thesis is that men must radically embrace biological realities, ignore societal noise, build overwhelming physical and financial strength, and utilize what he calls alpha arbitrage to reclaim their power and ensure their legacy.
Let's slow down and define alpha arbitrage, because that sounds like a Wall Street finance term. Buying low in one market and selling high in another. How does he apply arbitrage to biology and dating?
It connects back to a concept Riker calls Schrodinger's machismo.
Okay, explain that.
Women claim in surveys and on social media that they want vulnerable, soft, egalitarian male feminists. But consumer data and dating behavior show they overwhelmingly choose deep-voiced, dominant, wealthy alpha males. For example, Riker cites 2022 Stanford data showing that despite all the societal messaging about 50-50 equality, 72% of women still fully expect the man to foot the bill on a first date.
So they talk equality, but they demand traditional provision.
Exactly. Alpha arbitrage is the strategy of exploiting that massive hypocritical gap between what feminist media says women want and what women actually biologically respond to.
Give me an example.
Riker points to the cultural phenomenon of figures like Navy SEAL Jocko Willink and the highly controversial Andrew Tate.
Oh yeah, Jocko Willink's book outsells touchy-feely self-help books 10 to 1. His mantra is, discipline equals freedom. He tells men to wake up at 4:30 a.m. and lift weights.
And Andrew Tate, despite the media absolutely freaking out over his toxic image and trying to cancel him, gets 4 billion views on TikTok. Riker says this isn't an accident.
Not at all.
Tate is a master of alpha arbitrage. He is driving a Bugatti, smoking cigars, projecting raw dominance as a Darwinian billboard.
And this leads to Riker introducing the dread hierarchy, which is arguably the most controversial Machiavellian concept in the entire book. He argues that men need to build a revenge body in the gym and amass untraceable independent wealth.
The psychology behind the dread hierarchy is that because women are hypergamous and wired to climb status ladders, a man must constantly maintain a higher status than his partner to keep her attraction.
As Riker bluntly puts it, simps write poems. Chads write checks to themselves. He says that if you invest entirely in your own mission, your own business, and your own physical excellence, you create a dynamic of dread.
Meaning what, exactly?
The less you chase women, the more they will race to keep up with you, terrified of losing a high-status mate to a younger competitor. It's weaponizing the fear of missing out.
But it's vital to point out that Riker's ultimate message isn't just to pump iron, buy crypto, and stay single playing the field forever. That's a hollow victory.
Right. He has a massive generational goal.
He advises men to marry young sen, presumably to traditional women who haven't been indoctrinated by university systems, ignore the HR seminar hustlers, and focus on building multi-generational empires and producing heirs.
Right. He says your ultimate legacy isn't a 401k or a Porsche. It's the army of mini-yous who will inherit the earth. He wants men to play the long game. Let the cat ladies' therapy bills bankrupt the system as they age alone, while traditional red state dads are out coaching Little League, raising strong sons, and building parallel economies that the state can't control.
He draws heavily on historical precedent for this masculine revival, particularly the ethos of the early 20th century.
He specifically references Teddy Roosevelt's famous 1899 speech about the strenuous life. The idea of embracing hardship and rejecting soft, easy living. But how does Riker translate Roosevelt's 19th century Rough Rider ethos to a 21st century guy sitting in a cubicle?
Riker's final directive is deeply pragmatic, almost monastic in its discipline. He tells men to completely disconnect from mainstream narratives.
Just tune it out.
Literally turn off NPR, stop watching the news, delete the dating apps that are designed to monetize your desperation and lower your self-esteem. Instead, focus entirely on the physical and the tangible. Push more weight in the gym. Track your protein macros instead of obsessing over your ex's Instagram stories.
Get back to basics.
Learn to fix things.
Yeah.
Rely on torque wrenches, physical survival skills, and cold storage crypto wallets. It's a clarion call to become completely ungovernable by becoming entirely self-reliant. If you don't need the state cannot control you.
It's an incredibly intense, unyielding perspective on the world. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into Conrad Riker's Shackled.
But before we sign off, if we truly follow Riker's logic to its ultimate macroeconomic conclusion, it leaves us with a massive looming philosophical question, one that extends even beyond the scope of his book and affects every single person listening, regardless of their gender or politics.
Lay it on us. What's the end game here?
If this marriage strike continues to accelerate, if millions of highly productive, high-earning men successfully offshore their wealth into decentralized crypto, refuse to participate in the traditional family court system, and completely withdraw their taxable labor from the societal matrix because they refuse to be exploited, what happens to the nation-state itself?
Oh, man.
Think about it. The modern welfare state, the infrastructure, the subsidized programs Riker describes, they rely almost entirely on taxing male productivity to stay solvent. If the men Atlas shrug and walk away, does the ultimate red pill eventually mean the financial collapse of the very institutions that built the modern world?
Wow. If the men running the engine stop working, the whole factory goes dark. That is a heavy, terrifying thought to chew on. Listen, if you found this deep dive into the historical shifts of our institutions and the harsh realities of modern law fascinating, you absolutely must check out Amazon Kindle or Google Playbooks right now to buy Shackled, How the Marriage Revolution Betrayed Men by Conrad Riker.
It is a dense, provocative, and unapologetic read that will challenge almost every facet of modern social orthodoxy you've been taught.
You also need to follow the author on Substack. That's at Conrad-Air-N-Tag-Riker. And finally, please like and subscribe to this show so you don't miss our next deep dive. Keep questioning the narrative, keep building your knowledge, protect your assets, and we will see you next time.